Hi, everyone, and welcome to our podcast on population ecology. Before we get started, we have to go through a few definitions, and then we're going to be looking at what ecologically makes specific organisms important within their own ecosystem. So we're going to start really big here, and this is almost like a review of fifth grade, but we're going to look at the biosphere, and the biosphere is entire life containing area of the planet. So the part of the planet that's like all living things. So entire life containing area of the planet. So there's obviously some areas that don't contain life, like the center of the earth. However, if we even look at extreme areas like deep sea vents, we see life functioning there. So this is the part of the planet that contains life. That's the biosphere. An ecosystem is basically a community of living organisms, different species. And some examples would be like a coral reef or a tropical rainforest or in our area we have an ecosystem called chaparral, and that's when you're driving along the 101 and you look and you see a lot of bushes. There's a lot out by Morro Bay as well. So how about in your notes you put down about 2 more ecosystems that you can think of. So once again, an ecosystem is a community of living organisms that function together. And what I mean by community is we're looking at different species. So the coral reef, you have the fish that live there, the microorganisms that live there, the coral organisms, the algae, the plankton, the zooplankton, everything that functions to make that ecosystem thrive. And then we get a little bit smaller and we look at a community. A community is just a group of populations. So if we take this coral reef kind of idea and narrow it down in community, we might be looking at something like, the different types of coral species that live at a specific latitude. So this is narrowing it down a little more, still different species, but they still live together very closely. Or group of populations, sorry. And if we get a little closer, we have population. A population is a collection of individuals. I'm going to abbreviate this, but you should write it out. A collection of individuals of the same species in the same geographic area. Graphic. Let's see if I can fit this area. All right. So we went from broad biosphere all the way down to population, and of course the individual would be the one single organism that is involved in a population. So I'm going to give you an example of a population that I've recently got the chance to study. This, if it doesn't look familiar, it might soon, someday. This is Santa Cruz Island. This is one of the Channel Islands off of the coast of California. And hopefully you get a chance to go there. Our school goes there twice a year. And there's a species of bird that's endemic to the island. Now, endemic means that it's only found there. Its bird is not found anywhere else in the world, not even on any of the other Channel Islands. And this bird is called the island scrub jay. And you might look at it and say, oh, it looks just like the blue jays I see everywhere around my house. Well, if you put them side by side, you would see that these scrub jays actually are much brighter blue. They're not quite as much of a dusty blue, and they're a lot bigger. They're quite a bit bigger. And what's interesting about these island scrub jay is that they're found all throughout the island, but they're found in two pretty distinct places. The researchers that are there are tagging them. There's about 2,300 total, and they have about, I think they have about 1,700 tagged. And they're looking at them, and they see two distinct populations. They see one population that hangs out here. This is kind of a low part of the island. There's a lot of oak trees here. So these birds feed on acorns mostly. And then we have a high population where or a high area where there's not a lot of trees. So there's not a lot of birds there. And then we have this other area on the other side of the island that's mainly pine trees. So there's different soil there, a little bit different geology, and a little bit higher. So pine trees live there. And what they're seeing is that there's actually some big differences between these populations. This is an island scrub jay right here that lives on this side of the island and lives within the oak scrub bushes and eats acorns. And you could see that it has a pretty long beak. Okay, and so this allows the scrub jay, they actually stash their acorns, so they'll grab acorns and stash them in specific little hiding spots all throughout the island, and they'll remember where those are, up to several hundred locations. And then we have this, it's an island scrub jay as well, but this is one that's found in the pine forest, and you can see it has a shorter beak, which allows this scrub jay to get the seeds that are found within the pine cones of the trees on that side of the island. So even though these are the same species, technically, we're seeing two very different populations, both genetically they're finding, and also physically there's subtle differences. Also, since these birds don't travel very far, they're genetically very different. And so you could assume that these two populations might soon become two completely different species given a certain amount of time. So that's an idea of a population. You can see it's kind of a complicated description. But let's move on to what is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is defined by the interaction of its biotic and abiotic components. So it's how these two things affect each other. And if we look at something like water, so water is abiotic meaning non-living, and we see that other abiotic factors, how they affect the biotic factors. So if we're looking just at the amount of water, and we see how that affects what grows there, what can live there, how tall, how big can these things grow. So our abiotic factors that we look at are things like rainfall. So this right here is abiotic. So rainfall, what is the humidity, what's the elevation, so this is kind of like overall climate, but it's also looking at the soil type. So what are the available minerals in the soil? And this can also take into account metals that are found in soil. And given these things, we can, these abiotic factors, they directly affect directly affect the biotic factors. So if you think of a place that has heavy rainfall, high humidity, lower elevation, does that sound like a desert would be there? No, I'm thinking more of like a tropical rainforest or a temperate rainforest. So these abiotic factors are the things that really truly give rise to our different ecosystems and what can survive there. So if we have a greater amount of H2O, then we have a greater capacity for photosynthesis. So we have a greater capacity to support plants. So we would have more plants. So studying an ecosystem is really studying the interconnectedness, it's a tough word to say, interconnectedness of an area's abiotic and biotic factors. One thing that you're going to need to be familiar with is this idea of a niche. Now, I'm sure you've heard this before, like maybe you've heard a teacher say, oh, I think you've found your niche in drama, or I think you've found your niche in AP biology. But when we look at this in terms of an ecosystem, a niche is all of the biotic and abiotic factors that are used by an organism. Once again, a niche is all biotic and abiotic factors that are used by an organism. So if we look at something, so an organism is anything living, right? And living things use other living things, and they also need non-living things. So if we look at something like this golden eagle, so this right here is a golden eagle, and we start to look at its abiotic things. So golden eagle, they nest in cliffs, so they're going to need a cliff. They're going to need something to perch on, so they're going to need a tree. They're going to need water, just like any organism. So these would be some, this is biotic, but these would be abiotic factors. And if we look at the diet of it, well, the golden eagle is a bird of prey. So this golden eagle eats rabbits and squirrels and reptiles, and it's a carnivore. And we could tell it's a carnivore because it has this beautifully curved beak that it used to rip apart meat and be able to dissect its prey and digest it, because it doesn't have teeth. It's just able to kind of rip apart its prey by its curved beak. So the niche, we would say the niche of this golden eagle, one is a predator, a consumer, right? And a carnivore, and obviously flies. So this bird has a specific role in the ecosystem, and you would actually call this an apex predator. Would be a golden eagle, top of the food chain. Now let's take a different look at mushrooms. So this underneath the ground here, I'm sure you remember, but it's called mycelium. I'm just going to put an M, but you can spell it out. And then the top of the mushrooms, or the top of the fungus, is a flowering body, the mushrooms. And mushrooms are decomposers. That is their role in the ecosystem. They are heterotrophs, so that means that they use other organisms for their energy, and what they do use is broken down nutrients. They take things like detritus, which is like leafy matter, and organic matter in the soil, and they break it down to more usable components. And often these fungus can live symbiotically with a bunch of other organisms. So their niche is that they are decomposers, they're heterotrophs, they live symbiotically with other organisms, and they help break down the organic matter, and so it could be reused. So they're really important when it comes to cycles. The last one is a little more complicated. This is a clownfish, or since we're in biology class, an anemone fish. And you remember back to Finding Nemo that it lives with anemones. It's anemone, not anemone. just so you know. It's hard to get that one straight sometimes. And this clownfish, anemone fish, has a specific role. Not only is it it has a pretty diverse diet. It's an omnivore. It eats plankton, it eats mollusks, it eats algae, it eats crustaceans. But it also lives in a relationship with this other organism, a sea anemone. And what happens is this fish provides nutrients via its feces to this sea anemone, and in return it protects it from things that could potentially be harmful to the anemone as well. So not only is this fish, the niche of the fish, not only is it a consumer, but it also lives symbiotically, which means in partnership with or interaction with an anemone, and their relationship is called mutualism because they both benefit from it. So not only does it have a niche as a consumer, but it also has a niche that this anemone somewhat depends on this fish for its survival. So I think you guys have a good idea of what a niche is. We're going to look now at population distribution. Now, population distribution is just how populations distribute themselves around an area. And there's 3 specific different types that we're going to talk about on AP Biology. And the first one is, you might guess, is uniform. Now, a uniform is just an evenly spaced distribution of animals in an area. When I think of this, I think of when I'm driving along and I see a bunch of birds on a telephone wire. You can see that they're pretty much perfectly spaced apart. They're like, depending on the bird, but like 2 to 3 birds space apart. So they have a uniform distribution on that wire, if our wire was our little space to look at. Another one we have, you could see there's not really a pattern here. This is random. And we see this a lot with plants. Plants don't really get to choose where they're dispersed or where their seed ends up turning into a seedling. And so it goes wherever the wind takes it, and it happens to land where there's sufficient nutrients and it doesn't get dug up, then it gets to grow. So when I think of random distribution, I think of trees in a forest. The last one is clumped. And this is an organism or a population that kind of groups itself in little packs of individuals. And a lot of that can depend on available resources. We see a lot of this in intertidal zones where there's a certain amount of oxygen that organism needs in order to survive. So you see them kind of clumped in specific locations. So I have some examples here, a little quiz on our distribution. This is going to be our last slide. Here we go. So we've got some penguins. I'm sure most of you have seen March of the Penguins. And if you look at them, what would their distribution be? Guesses? All right, this would be uniform. If we look here, we have some of these beautiful bright purple starfish, and this is a intertidal zone. So the amount of oxygen available to animals depends on the time of day, and also their location vertically, elevation-wise above sea level. So a lot of times in tidal zones, you'll see clumps of animals, and you'll see actually different types of plants as you move away from the specific tide. So this would be clumped. Oops, clumped. There we go. And our last one, this is the example that I gave you before. Last but not least, we have our random distribution. All right, that concludes our first Ecology podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and have a fantastic day.